bring out all the technical things. Okay, it's on again, the recording.
Okay, here's my presentation. Thank you very much, Rodante, for this wonderful introduction. And thank you so much for organizing this summer school together with many others. It has been a huge work for you to organize this all. And therefore, after you have thanked everybody, I would like to ask a big round of applause for you from everybody. Let me see if I can go to the next slide. It doesn't go. How come? Need to go. Yeah, here it is. Because I want to express a word of gratitude to you too, Rodante. I think you are the main force behind this idea about the development of critical midwifery studies, together with a lot of others. But I think without you, it would not have led to this wonderful summer school. So I hope that everybody joins me in a big round of applause to share our gratitude towards you and to express.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. It's a huge honor to be invited to be a speaker at this summer school. It's also a very big honor to be the first one to speak here. I'm a care ethicist, as Rodante said. You said so much about everything that I do, and there are so many difficult names to pronounce. But basically, I consider myself a care ethicist. And as you said, this summer school is embedded in our care ethics group and our care ethics curriculum. And that's also what I want to do with my lecture today. I want to take you along to look at humanizing birth from a care ethics perspective. So these are the steps that I'm going to take. I think I'm looking a little bit sideways because on that screen, there's a better view of my slides. I'm going to tell you something about the background very briefly of the background for this summer school, because Rodante, of course, told you a lot about the critical midwifery studies developments that have been the basis for the summer school too. But then I'm going to quickly go to my field of expertise, which is care ethics. And I'm going to tell you a bit more about that. It's a particular kind of ethics, and I'm going to draw upon the wisdom of some of the care ethics classics for my contribution to the summer school today. I'm going to draw upon a few of those pioneers who tell us a lot about practices, which are so much the source for the knowledge that we develop in care ethics. But there's also a critical view of those practices, which I'm going to present to you, because of course, one of the focal points of the summer school is obstetric violence. And those practices have a lot of pitfalls and patterns, which I think we need to analyze in order to improve them. Perhaps after this part of my lecture, you may feel a bit down. So after that, I'm going to take a step to lift, I hope, the spirits, because the same practices are also the way out of these pitfalls and patterns, I believe. And as the aim of the group, Critical Midwifery Studies, as has been expressed by Rodante, as they show, I think the same practices that may have these pitfalls and patterns that take us down are also the sources from which we can arise again and to develop a reflexive caring midwifery practice. And I also believe that from the care ethics classics, we can draw to see how a discipline of itself can be developed from that. And I'll conclude, of course, with a sort of a wave pattern in which we must not ignore the pitfalls, but can also draw upon those pitfalls to lift ourselves up again. I hope that you can follow the development that I'll sketch in my lecture. So very briefly, a little bit of the background. Rodante already told about the collective that has developed this summer school, the collective of critical midwifery studies. But she also mentioned somebody is now doing something outside. I have my window open. I hope that you can still hear me very clearly. She performs the CARE study. And the CARE study is an abbreviation of the controversies surrounding autonomy and responsibility, the care ethical study into the mother-midwife relation. From her studies, Rodante is one of the persons who is launching the critical midwifery studies. And her study is embedded in the care ethics group at the University of Humanistic Studies. I might also perhaps briefly mention that we As far as we know, we host the only master's program in care ethics worldwide. We are in turn embedded in the International Care Ethics Research Consortium that Rodante also mentioned. You can look for more information about that on careethics.com. Let me say to you that one of the basic views, very important basic views, is expressed by one of the persons who is considered to be the pioneer of care ethics. She, so to speak, laid the groundworks for care ethics, and her name is Carol Gilligan. Carol Gilligan, you can find this wonderful video of hers on YouTube video series in the series of Big Think. This is the basic insight that I think lies at the foundation of care ethics. She did her research, and I'll tell you a bit more about that later on, among people, and they expressed a certain moral viewpoint. That viewpoint is expressed in this quote. They said, "We live in relationships. It's like you live on a trampoline, and if we move, it affects a whole lot of people." I think this is a basic quote that expresses what we draw upon when we develop care ethics, and perhaps also the care ethics perspective on midwifery studies. So, Carol Gilligan, who is she? She was, and she's still alive, so she still is a psychologist. And she wrote a very important book, In a Different Voice, Psychological Theory and Women's Development. And it was considered to be starting a revolution. It was an international bestseller, and she gained a lot of support for it, and she became very famous. She was Woman of the Year in 1984. And with her book, she launched the Justice Care debate. So she sort of posed something that draws upon care, and she just juxtaposed it to justice. That is not to say that she left justice behind or abandoned it, but it was a sort of debate, what can we draw upon in morality? Let me explain a bit more about that. She was a student of Lawrence Kohlberg. He was a very famous psychologist who did research into the moral development of boys. And his research also only did research among boys into moral development that they went through. He developed a staged model of moral psychological development, and this development was determined by the complexity of the argumentative structure of the boys that that were participants in his research. So it's not about the outcome of the argumentation that they had, but how complex was their argument. That was determining for the developmental stage that they were in, according to Kohlberg. The highest stage of his model was the stage where the boys could argue based upon the justice principle. And as I said, Gilligan discovered a different voice. She was an assistant in his research, and she heard a different voice. She said, I hear something else expressed, as I said in a previous slide. Her research was performed into the moral development among boys and girls. And she also, and this is much neglected in much of the literature on her work, she also did research among women considering abortion during the obligatory waiting time. She also developed this staged model of moral development. And in her model, the highest stage is not when people can argue based upon the justice principle. It's not even about the principle, but it is an argumentation based upon care, a more general insight into care and how that is performed and carried out, and how we receive care too. As many feminists, it is very important that she also contextualized her research. She said, my research is positioned in the early 70s, 1970s, so the 70s of the last century. It is much determined by the Roe versus Wade Supreme Court ruling, something I expect not to have to explain today to this audience. Of course, it's very relevant today again. She says many women for the first time considered themselves to be subjects with rights after that court ruling. Before that, they weren't very much unaware of them being subjects that had rights and could decide around abortion. The context, however, is also a little bit broader. There was a crisis at the universities. There were many demonstrations against the Vietnam War. There was a lot of violence, and exams were cancelled. And more basic to that, there was a re-examination of the foundations of knowledge altogether. And from this context arose the women's movement, and the voice metaphor was very central to that movement. Well, if you put together the two kinds of moral voices that she discerned, so the voice that Lawrence Kohlberg already described, you can say that in an ethic of justice, that's based upon the work of Kohlberg, a moral person is able to reason abstract, rationally, and from a detached point of view. The justice is a leading principle, and it's applied top down. It's a crucial development towards an understanding of justice and rules. So you have to top down apply a principle to concrete practices. So this is a reasoning top down, as the arrow also indicates. She says the different voice of care is very different from that. It is always aware of concrete situations, concrete responsibilities, and concrete persons in front of me. Of course, emotions are also involved. And a person reasoning in a caring way is a person who considers herself or himself or oneself as connected, as interdependent. Care is leading, and it's crucial in care to always be aware of concrete responsibilities in concrete relations. So it's not about judging in an impersonal way, but it matters that this certain person is in front of me, and that I'm responsible for her, or that she is responsible for me. So basic is the idea that practices are a source of moral insights. You reason bottom up from these practices. That's where you find what the good thing to do is. So bottom up instead of top down. Let's make a brief connection to midwifery practices. What kind of questions then arise from an ethical perspective when you relate this to midwifery practices? Is it so much about question, am I acting in a right way? Or is it more about, is this what I'm doing now also caring? Is it also doing something in a caring way? Or even, is acting in a caring way more important than acting in the right way at this present time, in this particular situation? And if you look at it from a relational perspective, it's also important to look at those involved in those practices. What do they have to offer? For instance, what do they see, hear, experience? What matters to them? And also to take into consideration that the people involved in those practices are persons who are being cared of, but are perhaps also people who want to care themselves. So how do they want to be cared for, and how do they care themselves? Of course, this is related to the role that a midwife might take. She cannot ask herself, have I listened? Have I observed caringly? How can I support their caring role? And how can I stay in relation with those persons involved? And those are always multiple persons. Relations are always multiple. Let me take you to a wider perspective to make a broader analysis of what is at stake in midwifery practices. I draw upon these classics, as I told you. Margaret Urban Walker and Sarah Ruddick. Margaret Urban Walker has something to offer about the practices and the knowledge that arises from those practices. She's a philosopher who thinks about epistemology, where does knowledge arise from, what is valid knowledge, etc. However, she does not use the term knowledge. She speaks of moral understandings in the plural. She says moral understandings about ourselves, our relations, and the good to do emerge in practices. So this is the same standpoint that Gilligan already expressed. But she looks more into how these practices are collaborative as well as expressive. And I'll tell you a bit more about that in the next slides. The second person is Sarah Ruddick. She thought about maternal practices. So practices about those people who mother. Mother is a practice. It's not an identity, but it's something that you do. So everybody can mother and can, in those practices, be in the role of a mother. She says, from practices, new ways of thinking emerge. this thinking is collectively and narratively shared and develops into a discipline. I think we can draw upon her insights for developing the discipline of critical midwifery studies. First, Margaret Urban Walker. I said already that practices are the source for understanding. So she does not speak of moral knowledge, but about understandings. And she speaks of a certain kind of practices. Those are practices of responsibility that form one's identity, one's values, and one's relationships, she says. How do they do that? They do that, she says, in an expressive, collaborative way. And it's also here that the moral model that she develops stems from. So she abandons the idea that morality is something that is theoretical and that is juridical. She says it's not about that. It's not about a detached way of judging, but it's about what we already do and how we express our morality in what we do. Because morality is expressive, she says. In practices, we show what is important and valuable by assigning, accepting, or refusing responsibility. So by looking at practices, we know what morality is about, she says. We can learn what it is about. We can learn about what we ourselves find valuable and what is considered of us in relationships, and also about which people accept responsibilities and what these responsibilities look like, and which people do not take responsibility, for instance. But I'll dig into that later. It is in these practices that we also always collaborate. These understandings, they are therefore also always interpersonal. We construe understandings of morality together, and we also establish them together. So this is the model that she develops. To sum up very briefly, these two pictures of morality, you can see on the left-hand side, that's Lady Justice. She's blindfolded. So that's a way of looking at morality from a very detached way, to disconnect yourself from concrete situations and understandings, and also from concrete persons in front of you. You must make a judgment without taking into account that you like a certain person, for instance, or that you're close to a certain person, for instance. She weighs the goods against each other on her scales, and of course the sword symbolizes the judgments that she makes. On the right-hand side of this slide, you see a completely different view of morality. Here it does matter who the person in need is and who I am in relationship to that person. Here, the good to do is not something that you must judge about in an impartial way, but it's very much something that involves your affectivity, your embodiedness, the personal view that you have of the good to do. And of course, the skin-to-skin contact is very important here for the good that you try to establish. It might be considered as a romanticized view, but it's only meant to be an illustration of two pictures of morality. To which view of morality are we drawn? I hope you are all drawn to the right-hand side picture of morality in this, because that's what we as care ethicists also try to implement in practices, without leaving justice behind, as I said before. Let's go a little bit further into Margaret Urban Walker's view of morality, because if practices are collaborative, and if in practices we also express what we find valuable, we must take into account that people in practices always take different positions, and also that we need those different positions to establish what moral problems are and what kind of solutions we can find. Therefore, I took this picture of people standing in a certain relationship towards each other, and to emphasize that it's important to acknowledge that differently positioned people know, feel, experience, see, hear, believe, are entrusted and consider different things. And that also counts for them seeing different moral problems and different kinds of answers to those problems. However, these practices in which people are positioned also create the problems and the pitfalls of those practices. So this is where the critical analysis of those practices starts. Margaret Urban Walker says, practices lead to necessary identities. And necessary identities means the social role or status that is inevitably or comfortably well fitted to the people whose social position it is, because of some naturally occurring feature of those people. You can compare this. I draw upon her work in a sort of close reading, but I try to link it to practices of midwifery time and time again. You can compare this idea of necessary identity also to what happens in midwifery practices. You can see, for instance, that the laboring person might be assigned a necessary identity as a passive, irrational, unknowing person, versus perhaps the necessary identity of the professional as an active, rational, or knowing person. Let's look some more at what Walker says about this necessary identity. Necessary identities, she says, are socially constituted. A's are identified as B's by C's, which may include themselves and or others, in the context of certain institutions or practices, or to certain ends. Again, you can compare this to laboring persons who consider themselves irrational, are considered as irrational, and are also treated as irrational beings. This is how that necessary identity is constituted, according to Walker. But why then is it a necessary identity? If it is socially constructed, does that not also entail that they can be changed socially too? Walker says no, it's not that easy, because necessity is rooted in power. The necessity of certain identities, she says, is not, after all, for those who bear them, but for those who might otherwise have to account for the ways they treat those people. So power and practices are interrelated. And how does that work? They are interrelated in practices. As power and practices are interrelated, I said. She looks at a more deep level, a deeper level at how these necessary identities are constructed. She says we should look for the apparent necessity of identities then in many facts about who has recognized power over whom and how the power is expected to be exercised. The power includes asymmetric or lopsided epistemic authority some have over others, and the muting or absence of the voice of subordinates. Here the metaphor of voice is emphasized again. These are facts about who gets to do what to whom and who gets to talk about what gets done, and is taken seriously by those with the power of authoritative judgment. This is quite some statement, I think, that sheds a light upon what happens in those practices and why there are so many pitfalls that re-establish power hierarchies over and over again. She also sheds some light, and I think this is an important analysis that she makes upon how does it work. She says this happens by making treatments of some people look matter of course, where those treatments would be extraordinary for some other people, especially for those delivering the treatment. And then again, the question is in place, how can you make the treatments look matter of course? She says she distinguishes three processes: the process of naturalizing, privatizing, and normalizing. And these all work together by making these identities look and practices look matter of course. And they result in an epistemic firewall, which means a wall between some who know and have the power to know and others who cannot know. I'll take you along her analysis and to her conclusion of this epistemic firewall. I think this is very helpful analysis for midwifery practices too. Making identities and treatments of those identities as matter of course, happens by naturalizing those identities, she says. The easiest way to do that is by making these identities no entry and no exit and identities. Here's a quote from her again. The most effective implementation of naturalized identities is making them conditions of birth, ceasing at death. Individuals upon whom the identities are conferred simply find themselves in them from the point of self-consciousness, and others never know them otherwise. For instance, woman, colored, or black. Another process is the way to treat those identities is by privatizing their treatment to prevent scrutiny. This can happen by literally privatizing those treatments, by perform them behind doors, walls, or fences, or by making them virtually private, which is very interesting, I think, with respect to obstetric violence, because they can happen in plain sight and yet still be considered as private. She says this is affected by customs, moral understandings, or laws that declare certain interactions outside legitimate or acceptable scrutiny, reaction, or public comment by others, even if those interactions take place in plain sight or in places not private in the former sense. The third process is by normalizing the treatment of those necessary identities. Normalizing, she says, happens by patterns of practice. Certain patterns of behavior and relations are normalized when there are effective norms pertaining to them, but the norms presume these relations and patterns to exist as a threshold of application for the norms. For instance, this is, of course, again, an example taken from midwifery practices. When it is presumed that a laboring person is irrational, the focus shifts from the coercion that she experiences to actions that are permitted. Normalizing then consists in regulation of patterns of practices instead of prohibiting these practices. And this is her quote again: when practices that otherwise would look bad are rendered normal, so normalized in these ways for certain contexts or certain people in them, those who rebel against what everybody accepts appear as irrational freaks, malcontents, complainers, unstable deviants, or dangerous elements out of control. This happens, of course, when people are discredited who demand self-control, for instance, in birthing practices. Naturalizing, privatizing, and normalizing then form a sort of epistemic firewall, sealing off recognizable injuries and credible complaints, she said. I think these are characteristics of complex uphill battles, like the one against obstetric violence. It's a sort of catch-22 situation. Protesters discredit themselves. And I couldn't express this better than Margaret Obenwalker does herself. The unnaturalness, exhibitionism, or abnormality of their claims or pleas or behavior itself shows or even proves their unreliability as judges and informants, the incredibility of their testimonies. A reduced, circumscribed, or discredited status as knowers and claimers, being epistemically marginalized or unauthorized, is no small working part of the identities of those necessarily subordinate. It is not just what their views, it is not just that their views don't count. Given what those people are, their views can't count. So therefore, no identity is so necessary as one that successfully precludes its bearers confuting it. So this is what happens with the epistemic firewall. Those protesting against it cannot make their point valid because they themselves have been discredited as claimers, as claimants, as knowers, etc. Let's keep these pitfalls and patterns in mind with regard to midwifery. Perhaps you now have a very negative feeling about practices, but I try to lift your spirits up again, as I promised at the start of my lecture, because I think we can also draw upon those practices still for knowledge and for improving those practices. And for that, I draw upon classical work of Sarah Ruddick, maternal thinking. She thought about maternal thinking And as I said before, mothers in her view are not mothers in the classical sense of an essential identity, but mothers are people performing a certain kind of care. And that can be anybody. She is also a thinker about how can we develop knowledge from those practices. She says we need to conceptualize truth in a certain way. And she says distinctive ways of knowing and criteria for truth arise out of practices. So she too draws upon the same sources that Gilligan and Walker drew upon. She is also one of the founders of care ethics, to be honest. So she developed a so-called practicalist conception of truth, and she was inspired by Wittgenstein, for those of you who are philosophically interested. She defines practices as follows. Practices are collective human activities distinguished by the aims that identify them and by the consequent demands made on practitioners committed to those aims. I want to draw upon her work and to make the connection to midwifery practices because I think she has much to offer for midwifery practices and also for midwifery studies. So if you look at mothering and you say this is a practice that is defined by its aims and by the demands that grow up from those aims, you must look at the aims and the demands. The aims of mothering are distinguished by her as being preservation, growth, and social acceptability of the child. From those aims, the following demands arise. The demands of mothering are preservative love, nurturance, and training. Perhaps this might be an example for midwifery studies as well. And this is something that I give to you as something that you can discuss or that we can discuss together, of course. Might, for instance, the aims of midwifery be also preservation, perhaps becoming, and might it also be caring for supportive relations and a supportive environment? And can we also then think about the demands that are put to midwives? Might the demands be preservative care, nurturance, and relational care? It's a sort of resonating model from maternal thinking that Ruddock developed. Somebody has the microphone open. I don't know if everybody is aware, perhaps that's you can hear the noises that you make. So perhaps mute yourself, person who has the microphone open. Thank you very much. Ruddock also says there are certain things that are typical of maternal practice. Each maternal practice must be attuned to the particular demands of each unique child. So time and time again, you cannot pose a general rule of something, but you must attune to the particular child. And not only that, maternal practice is also always historically and culturally determined. So there are differences from time to time and from place to place, especially where it concerns the second and the third aim of maternal practice, nurturance and training for social acceptability. We have different views in different places and in different times. And the third characteristic of maternal practice is that goals might be simultaneously relevant, but also conflicting from time to time. So while you aim for one aim, might be in conflict with the other aim. So there's conflict at the heart of maternal practice. I wonder, does the same go for midwifery practice? Is it not also the case that midwifery practice is always attuned to the particular demands of each laboring person? Is it also not the case that what you do differs from time to time and from place to place and is much historically and culturally determined, or at least influenced, especially where it comes to the second and the third aim of midwifery practice, nurturing, becoming, and care for a relational environment? And I also believe that, for instance, goals in midwifery practice are simultaneously relevant and might also be conflicting at the same time. What then of maternal thinking? So not maternal practice, but maternal thinking. Ruddick describes maternal thinking as strategic and conflict managing. As I said, conflict is at the heart of maternal practice. So thinking also needs to concern the conflicts that are there at the heart of that practice. How can we manage conflicts? Maternal thinking can also be characterized as always searching for meaning. This also involves balancing the importance of the various goals, of course. She says thinking is a particular kind of thinking that can also be developed into a certain kind of discipline. For instance, the discipline might consist of identifying mothering virtues. That's only one aspect of the thinking that is involved, but it might be so important that we can also see that as a certain way of knowing that can be a discipline. Perhaps we can identify virtues that are more general to everybody. But she also always acknowledges that knowing certain things does not necessarily or inevitably lead to also practicing what you know. There's a constant struggle here going on too. I wonder if the same goes for midwifery. Perhaps midwifery thinking is the same, it can be described in a similar way. It is always strategic and conflict managing. It is also searching for meaning, and it's about balancing the importance of various goals. Perhaps midwifery thinking also includes the possibility to be developed into a discipline. I think so, I believe so. And it might also include trying to discern midwifery virtues. And we must also always be aware, I believe, that it's always about not only knowing, but also about practicing, but there's a constant struggle going on. There's also a way out, I promised you. And I think Ruddick describes that very wonderfully in this long quote that I give to you, because he puts storytelling central to maternal thinking and also at the heart of developing this discipline. So storytelling is not only a practice, but it's also a way of thinking, and it's a way of developing thinking and developing discipline. I give you this quote. Partly because it is believed that women think concretely, so women not in an essentialistic way, that women think concretely, concrete cognition sometimes appear as defective thought or thoughtlessness. Actually, the reflectiveness of concreteness must be developed through disciplined attentiveness and then expanded and tested through critical conversational challenge. Maternal conversations are important instruments of self-confidence. In their storytelling, mothers share and elaborate their observations, making a coherent, often amusing, dramatic, or poignant story of their children's particularities. Individually and collectively, they rehearse their judgments and establish continuities in their ongoing nurturing activities. Ideally, a mother's stories are as beneficial to her children as they are to her. As she pieces her children's days together, a mother creates for herself and her children confidence that the children have a life very much their own and inextricably connected with others. I asked the question on this slide, can this be applied to midwifery? But the answer to me is yes, I think it can. If we draw upon Ruddick, the power of midwifery practice is in the practice. The power of midwifery thinking emerges from the practice, and the power of midwifery development is in storytelling. And finally, the power of critical midwifery studies then is in reflection upon practices, upon thinking, and upon storytelling. So perhaps the long quote that I gave to you from Ruddick can also be applied to midwifery. I modified it for this purpose. In their storytelling, midwives share and elaborate their observations, making a coherent, often amusing, dramatic, or poignant story of their birthing person's particularities. Individually and collectively, they rehearse their judgments and establish continuities in their ongoing midwifery activities. Ideally, a midwife's stories are as beneficial to her clients and colleagues as they are to her. As she pieces her clients' birthings together, A midwife creates for herself and her clients and colleagues the confidence that the birthing persons have experienced a life's event, very much their own and inextricably connected with others. So if we draw upon Ruddick, I believe that practices require thinking, and that from thinking a distinctive discipline emerges that might establish criteria for determining failure and success, for setting priorities, and identifying virtues that the discipline requires. I think this also goes for midwifery. But then, of course, we must also be critical. How about the patterns and pitfalls of practices that were identified by Margaret Urban Walker? How about the necessary identities? How about naturalizing, privatizing, and normalizing subordination and creating an epistemic firewall? Now, I think midwives and mothers or laboring persons face the same epistemic firewall. In the same way, their identities are naturalized, privatized, and normalized. So we need to include these analyses that Margaret Urban Walker offers. We need to foster awareness, and we need to fight for justice and also for care. I think we should keep in mind that it need not be perfect to be effective. And I took this from a poem written by Mustafa Titu. We might need error as much as trial, is what I mean to say with that. So that's why I put this symbol on this slide. There will continue to be pitfalls and patterns. There will be a struggle. Knowing what to do is not the same as failing to do it, to bring it into practice. So therefore, I think we need to look and keep looking critically at those practices and lift our spirits up from those practices. And then perhaps we are not going to be perfect beings, but we can be more aware and we can learn from trial and error and improve those practices. So this is what I think is my conclusion. Critical midwifery studies should be and already is an interdisciplinary field of inquiry into midwifery care. It is fighting ignorance and fighting for care and justice, and it will be launched this week. And I congratulate everybody who works for that. I thank you for your attention. Here you can see where you can reach me if you have any questions, suggestions, remarks, or criticism. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Inge, for this wonderful, wonderful opening lecture. It's amazing how you have translated Sarah Ruddick's maternal practice and maternal thinking to midwifery. And I think this is very apt and an amazing beginning of this week and of thinking critical midwifery studies further as firmly rooted in practice and in care. So thank you so much for this. We have 15 minutes for questions. You can put either your questions in the chat and then I can read them, or you can just put up your hand and ask them yourself. So please do take this opportunity to ask a question to Inge or to share a thought. Everybody is still processing your lecture. Maybe then I can try to make a question. I was wondering if you could maybe say a little bit more, because it was very, very beautiful how you actually made of midwifery care already a discipline of thought just by the care and the practice it does, and that and by starting the reflection on this care and that turning midwifery into a discipline. But maybe you can say a little bit more of how we are to deal with systemic injustice and structures of oppression that we ourselves reproduce but that we might be unaware of. So how do we, you know, if we start from our own practice, yeah, how do we illuminate them, and how do we resist them?
Yeah, I think that's the theme of the entire week, isn't it, Rodante? So I think the answers will come from a lot of other persons, also people who are much more involved in midwifery practices and have spent their life already, dedicated their life already to the studies of these systems and the ways that violence is also re-performed again and again. I think it's Ruddock also and Walker too offers ways out. That's of course why I put them central in my lecture. I think one of the things is to be, for instance, you remember the two pictures that I had of the two pictures of morality. So if you don't look like a lady justice, but if instead you include your bodily feeling, your affectivity, your knowledge in the practice, the concrete person in front of you, the concrete feelings that you yourself have. If you take these as sources of moral knowledge and moral awareness, I think many of the people in practices already know what hurtful practices are, how violence is there, how pain is there. If you open up to those signals that you, I think you have in your own, own bodily experiences, etc. I think if you take that seriously and you know, the only thing is, how can you resist the systems that make you do certain things? I think what you have done already, what you have described in your word of welcome also, is the only way out, by creating collectives, by looking at practices together, by reflecting upon them, by not taking them as individual guilt or something to be ashamed of, but by discussing them, by telling stories, by reflecting upon them, by identifying every aspect of particular situations. Perhaps that's an important way out too. So I think, yeah, you create a force then also that can fight this uphill battle, and that perhaps can bring about systematic change. Might be naive, might be romantic, but perhaps, yeah, that's helpful. I'll change something to my system here so that I don't look away from my camera.
Thank you. No, that's very helpful indeed. There's 2 questions in the chat. Do the people who put their question in the chat want to ask it themselves, or shall I read it? If you want to ask it yourself, please unmute, Meerte.
I will try. Hi, I'm Meerte. Thank you so much for this lecture. Yes, I'm not very into care ethics, and I'm not very I don't know it very well. So I do know Foucault a little bit, and I was wondering if you could say something about, just so I can understand, like a difference between the way Foucault describes power structures and like what is within the true and how that excludes people, and the difference between this analysis of Walker that you explained, and also the ways out that you describe, how that maybe relates to Foucault's work, because then I can understand better.
Well, thank you for that question. Unfortunately, I'm not an expert in Foucault's work, so that's very difficult for me to build that bridge. But as far as I know his work, I think it might be related, but it's very hard for me now to build that bridge in 1 minute or something like that. But I think the sources that I mentioned, so the thinkers on which I draw, are, I think, very much rooted in the women's movement. And I think much of what they say, drawing upon practices, etc., has to do with what the women's movement in the 1970s was all about. And And it's about taking seriously what you experience in those practices. So putting women's experiences central. It might be that there are similarities to Foucault's thinking, but I also know that Foucault has been much criticized from a feminist perspective. And he did not include these feminist thoughts in his work. So after that, many feminists complemented his analysis with feminist insights. So there might be something similar, but there might also be quite important differences that were overlooked earlier, and perhaps also need still to be. So the critique on Foucault still needs to be developed further. But as I said, I'm not an expert in Foucault's work, unfortunately. Perhaps I know that Rodante is, so perhaps she can help me here.
Well, I don't know, maybe we should, I mean, thank you, but maybe we should go, there's also a next question, and there's also, Priya also want to ask a question, so maybe we can do that, and then we can center your lecture instead of Foucault's work, and we can talk about Foucault more later.
Yeah, that's good.
Hannah Thompson has a question. Would you like to ask it yourself, or?
Yeah, yes. Can do. Hi everyone, I'm Hannah. I'm a midwifery educator in the UK. And thank you, Inge, for that wonderful opening lecture. Can I ask, everything you say makes so much sense to us as practitioners, and we feel it in our bones. It's very difficult. As a pragmatist, I wonder, how can we convey this thinking in a practical sense, and how can we push for it to be recognized in I practice in a very male-dominated obstetric environment, and this way of thinking just isn't valued. It's seen as lesser. I've been called a witch, which I have no problem with, but how do we move forward with pushing for this to be valued?
Thank you very much, Hannah, for sharing not only your question, but also your experience. And your question and your information that you gave about how you practice also underscore the idea that you're on the same side of the epistemic firewall that Margaret W. Walker described. So I'm very sorry for you for being called a witch, which is quite something. And I want to underscore this too at the beginning of the summer school. You are facing the same uphill battle that all feminists faced and still face, I believe, of being discredited for who you are, and therefore your knowledge is also discredited. So that's what the pessimistic part of my lecture was about. I tried to be optimistic by drawing upon Ruddick, but yeah. So what you describe as the circumstances in which you work, it does not perhaps apply. It's not a good context for this optimism. But still, I believe that the only way out is to work together, is to sometimes do something like brush it off your shoulder, like, okay, those are the men. I'll continue to believe what I believe in, and to work together with others who believe the same things that I believe in. I think joining forces, working together, creating this new discipline of critical midwifery studies, I strongly believe that that is the way forward. And due to what you said, I'm aware that many of you are soloists facing this uphill battle by themselves in a male-dominated context. All the more reason to join this collective, I believe, and to find support together. Because if we create this movement, perhaps now it's the time to create this movement, perhaps we can also make our voices heard. So it's still this metaphor of voice, and to create a powerful counter movement against the obstetric system in which you find yourself. I'm so sorry, Hannah, to hear this from you. But of course, makes the summer school more relevant too, that you share this experience. You want to say something? Sorry.
No, it's okay, but thank you. Thank you for your answer. That's really helpful.
Okay, I hope so.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone. We're already over 10 minutes over time. So I saw that Priya had a question, but Priya, is it an essential question now, or can it maybe wait? Yes? Okay, thank you. Or you want to ask it? If it is a quick question, please go ahead, but okay. Because in 5 minutes already, the lecture from Amrita Banerjee starts. But we need a short break, I think. So let's start 5 minutes later. So we will start 11:05 with the lecture from Amrita Banerjee. Thank you so much again, Inge, for your wonderful, wonderful lecture. And maybe you can share your slides with us, because I think your slides were really great as well to develop critical midwifery studies further. Well, a warm round of applause for Inge, and then we'll have a break.
Thank you, Rodant. And of course, I'll share my slides
Thank you.
in It's Learning.